Webinar. Great, that's fine too. We can always edit out the early moments. Welcome to our webinar. And I see people already logging in. Thank you all for being here. So happy you could join us for the first webinar in our Investing in Climate Action for Jobs, Health, and Equity webinar series here at the Climate Center. We've got an exciting lineup of speakers. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes as people log in, and then we'll get started right at 10 o'clock, and we will end at or no later than 11:30 as advertised. Chris has raised his hand. Chris, do you have a thought or comment?
I have up to 12 minutes. I was just double checking on the time.
That's correct, from 10:11 to 10:23. Very, very, very specific. Yeah, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. And I'm happy to see folks logging in. We have over 300 people registered, which I think is a sign of how critical this issue is and how many people want to find out what we can do to invest in solutions to this critical climate crisis that we find ourselves in. As my colleague Ellie likes to say, our house is on fire. So it's time to invest into a sprinkler system, or maybe even, redesign the whole house. That's there's a lot to be done, and we're going to talk about a lot of that today. Thank you all for logging in. I'm just going to give it one more minute for folks to log in, and we've got some tech support here. Our colleague Lorianne is here. If anybody's having any trouble logging in, you're welcome to let us know. Of course, if you're here, you did not have any trouble logging in. No, Ellie, hold on just a moment. I'll do a couple of quick slides as an intro and then turn it over to you. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and do that now as we prepare and welcome everybody. So I'm very happy so many good folks could be here today. And here we go. I'm going to do a quick share here, present. And I see people logging on. I know that more folks are coming. I see them logging on fast and furious. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the Climate Center's webinar on the human and economic costs of inaction. My name is Duran. I'll be your host and MC today. We have an incredible lineup of speakers and presenters, and we're very happy you could join us also. This webinar is part of our webinar series. The webinar series is titled Investing in Climate Action for Jobs, Health, and Equity. And this is the kickoff webinar. So we're really happy that you could be here. Again, we'll be talking about the human and economic costs of inaction. After I'm done with a couple of minutes of introductions, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Ellie Cohen, who will give us an update from Glasgow and talk about Climate Safe California and how you can join our movement. And then we're going to hear from Chris Bush of Energy Innovations, followed by Senator Elena Gonzalez from Southern California. There'll be an opportunity for Q&A with both of them. And then we'll hear from Ibrahim Al-Husseini of Full Cycle Climate Partners, who's going to be talking about the opportunities for investment in climate action. We're very excited. Want to make sure that you know that the webinar series will continue on Thursday, December 16th. We'll be talking about maximizing benefits from climate investments with Dr. Manuel Pastor, Dr. Dan Kamen, and a number of other distinguished speakers. My colleague Lorianne will drop a link into the chat if you would like to register for that. We encourage you to please do that. We will continue the conversation through that and webinars all through the first part of next year on mobility, workers, energy resilience, farmers, and more. Before I turn it over to Ellie, I would just like to take a moment to thank all our sponsors who make this possible. We're very happy to be sponsored by banks like Summit State Bank, River City Banks, energy companies like Blue Planet Energy, CCAs, community choice aggregators like MCE, Willow Creek Wealth Management. Of course, I also want to thank Full Cycle for Ibrahim's presence here today. And I want to thank our promotional partners. All of these organizations have helped spread the word about this webinar. They're part of the reason why you're here today. If you'd like more information on becoming a partner, promotional partner, or a sponsor of our webinars or our organization, please contact me. My name again is Duran at theclimatecenter.org. And with that, I'd like to turn it over now to my colleague, Ellie Cohen, the CEO of the Climate Center, for a little update on Climate Safe California, and tell us a little bit about what happened in Glasgow. Ellie?
Great, thank you so much. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, super. Well, first, I'm going to just frame a little bit what we're doing and why we're doing this webinar series. And yes, I have just returned from Glasgow, and it was an incredible and frustrating experience. I want to thank Senator Gonzalez, Ibrahim, and Chris so much for joining us today. As we all know, the current global climate goals are inadequate. It was established in 2018 from the UN IPCC 1.5C report that we have to cut emissions basically in half by 2030 and remove upwards of 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide equivalents or warming compounds from the atmosphere to get to net zero by 2050 and stay under 1.5. We are nowhere near that. We are actually going in the opposite direction. And unfortunately, the United Nations, or fortunately, but it is that the United Nations operates by consensus. And so the goals are inherently conservative and not enough. We know from the latest science that we have to do much more, much sooner. One key point is that we are now expected to pass 1.5C, that dangerous level of warming, by 2030 globally, 10 years earlier than was projected. And for California, it could be as early as 2027, with very devastating impacts for our agriculture, for our frontline communities, and for us all. It's code red for humanity, as UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in August, in relation to the new IPCC assessment report on the latest science. No temperature rise is safe. So we can talk about 1.5 and 2.0. Here in California, we know what's already happening with 1.1C, 1.2C of warming. And what our theme is today is about climate action. Delay costs much, much more than investing now. We'll hear more about that from Chris. But just think about the 2018 wildfires. An analysis was done, the wildfires that destroyed the town of Paradise cost $150 billion, or almost 2/3 of the state's annual budget, just from one area of wildfires. And this is the whole supply chain impact. It's huge, it's enormous, it's deadly. And we know when we invest up front, we can create thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs. At the Glasgow summit, here's a picture with several of our electeds and some of the other people that were part of our delegation there. It was amazing and inspiring to be there. I was able to participate in the 100,000 people march on that Saturday. And there were some good things that came out of it, getting to a new global agreement with 120 nations to cut methane by 30% by 2030. For the first time ever since the COPs began, the conferences of the parties in 1994, there's a reference in the closing language that to phase down coal and fossil fuel subsidies. The Beyond Gas Alliance was established by Denmark and Costa Rica, agreement to stop deforestation, increase financial commitments. But you know, the proof is in the pudding. They got to really implement it, and it has not happened year after year after year. And basically, it is not enough for the climate crisis. They've kicked the can down the road for yet another year, and current commitments still put us on track for anywhere between 1.8 to 2.4, and some say even higher for global warming. And we know it's like the scale for earthquakes. It's not just incremental, it is logarithmic, and the impacts get greater and greater. Bottom line, the climate reality is outpacing the policy. Some leaders are stepping up. We heard from Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon in Glasgow that California is not leading anymore. One of the great things about having our elected officials go there was to meet people from around the world, from cities, from other states and other nations, and finding out what they're doing to inspire us to do more. We are behind in California. We're behind the EU, we're behind the UK, behind Rhode Island, and even behind our own president, which is not where California has been in the past on climate change. But we know bold targets work. We have numerous laws that we've passed in California and executive orders recently that have stimulated responses to impact other states and our nation and the world to greater climate action. The nation and the world are looking to us. We need more aggressive, equitable policies now in California. And we have launched the Climate Safe California campaign 2 years ago, so that by 2025, California will have enacted the bold policies required by science to dramatically cut emissions, start that drawdown, and secure resilient communities for everyone by 2030, inspiring global action. We know that our current existing policies for 2045 to get to carbon neutral and net negative is simply too late. We can't wait another 24 years. And so our proposal is that we double our goals for 2030 to get to 80% below 1990 levels by 2030 and scale up big time nature-based sequestration goals that will have all sorts of other benefits for resilience to drought, for support of biodiversity, and for food security. This shows some of the pathways to get us there. And this will be available online if you want to look at this in more detail. But we have 4 main areas of policy that have to be implemented soon at scale to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuel development, production, and use, scale up nature-based sequestration, invest in community resilience, including clean energy microgrids and storage, and funding climate action, the theme of this webinar series, with somewhere from 12 to 20 billion a year and leverage private sector funding. Our guiding principles for climate safe California, it's got to be based on the latest science. We have to ensure a just transition for fossil fuel workers, their families, and their communities. And we have to prioritize climate justice and ensure that lower income communities, communities of color, are no longer disproportionately harmed by fossil fuels, and that they have equal access to solutions. So I ask you all today to please, if you haven't yet, to endorse Climate Safe California. You can go to climatesafeca.org, and I'm sure that Janina will put the link here in the chat for you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We can do more, and we must do more for addressing the climate crisis. We can do it together, and California can lead again. Thank you so much. Duran, please.
Well, thank you, Ellie. It's always great to hear your perspective, and we certainly encourage everyone who has not yet done so to endorse Climate Safe California. I would add to what Ellie says that a number of the folks here have already endorsed. We have over 1,450 business leaders, elected officials, community leaders, folks like yourselves who are tuning into the webinar today who've already endorsed, and you can easily add your name by clicking on the link that Lori Ann provided. And we're gonna have an opportunity for those of you who've already endorsed to help spread the word more broadly in our Take Action segment towards the end of the webinar here today. One other item of housekeeping, we really want to encourage a robust discussion. You may not be on camera, but if you're attending this webinar, we want to know what you think. Please put your questions in the Q&A. Please note there is a chat and there is a Q&A. It's better if you put your questions in the Q&A, and my colleague Barry Vesser will be sorting those questions so that when we get to our first and then our second Q&A period, we'll have the opportunity to hear from you as well as our esteemed speakers. And I note that the senator has joined us. She'll be up in just a little while. But before we get to that, I'd like to introduce Chris Bush. Chris is Research Director at Energy Innovations, where he leads the firm's California Climate Policy Program and provides evidence-based reasons for optimism in the battle against climate change. Evidence-based reasons for optimism is something I want to hear more about. But what we're going to talk about today is the costs of delaying climate action. What is the cost of delay? Chris, you've got about 10, 12 minutes to cover the items in your report. Encourage everyone to drop your questions in the Q&A, and I'm happy to turn it over to Chris. If you want a fuller bio, please click on the link in the chat and you can get his full bio. In the meantime, Chris, take it away. And Chris, we don't hear you yet, FYI.
That old trick of unmuting. Apologies. Thank you, Duran, and thanks to the Climate Center for the invitation to be a part of this panel. I'm looking forward to the conversation to come. And a little about Energy Innovation. We're a climate policy think tank with a singular focus on making a real world difference. So with that, let's see. Sorry, here we go. Back at the start of my presentation, which you'll see is about the cost of delay with a focus on California, and a bit about why this matters. I would say, first of all, it really clarifies our choices, and really either we act rapidly and at massive scale to avoid the worst consequences, or we suffer terribly. And either outcome involves transformational change. Sometimes I mention this because people talk about, going slow as a more moderate strategy, but it really isn't. There's also terrible uncertainty and consequences and dislocation on that path. So As well, Daron mentioned I'm an economist by training, recovering economist, you might say, because really they haven't been so helpful, I would say, as a profession to the climate policy debate. But I do think when you look at the reality of where we've come, there's a lot of opportunity. So hope to bring it back with a bit of optimism at the end. Next, an outline of where we're going with the talk. Ellie did such a great job of covering what Glasgow means that we'll really quickly skip over that. The point being, there is a lot more that has to be done, and quickly, or else the costs of inaction will grow. Briefly, I'd like to get in here, this climate extremes become the norm, to a bit of climate science as background. The heart of our discussions, the third topic there, will be some deep dive on the cost of delay, and then we'll wrap up. So post Glasgow, you can see really at best, if you believed every commitment everyone made, regardless of the enforcement mechanism, we'd be on track for 1.8. And there's a lot of squishiness in those commitments, which is why we have to get real laws and regulations in place to drive the change we need to see. A bit about the climate science, and what I wanted to really communicate here is that we talk about these changes in average temperature, and I would say a lot of times they obscure the gravity of the situation, and it's really the extremes that are going to be coming at us in the future because of the energy that we're feeding into the atmosphere. And so the average temperature discussions don't really capture the science very well. Of course, California, we know all too well about the wildfire risks. We're also likely to see some intensive flooding in the future, worsened by climate change as well, and the drought we're seeing. So some real important impacts to our quality of life. Sea level rise, obviously another issue. I wanted to bring this home with two recent extremes of precipitation being great and minimal. In Sacramento, we're set, two new record extremes were set in October, with the city both experiencing a period ending in 212 days without rain, which ended with the October rain we saw, which on October 24th brought the most rain that had ever been registered or recorded in a single day. So that's a bit of a local example of how these extremes are manifested already, and what we're facing if we don't get serious about decarbonization. So this next bit is about extreme temperatures, and what we're going to see here is what we're looking at is a distribution of temperatures from 1950 to 1980, average temperatures, which they come out to close to like a normal, what's called a normal distribution. About a third of temperatures are at the average in the middle there, a third are hotter than that average band, and a third are colder. We're going to see how a relatively small change in temperature then leads to actually a large introduction of new extreme temperatures beyond previous experience. So here we're looking at, it's not running now. This is supposed to be an animated video. It's not running this time for some reason. Anyway, you can see this is the point here. When the new average and this is only maybe some fraction of the warming we've experienced so far, but looking at this warming that occurred from 2001 to 2011 and the shift in average temperatures that it created, it led to a whole new set of extreme temperatures making up 1/12 of summer days. So that just shows, and it's really those extreme temperatures where the damages of climate change are felt most strongly. And so that's why average temperatures can be misleading when we talk about climate change, and it's really the extremes that we're unleashing that are the issue. Okay, getting into the cost of delay, I wanted to cover a few different aspects of the cost of delay. One is when we delay action, we're basically creating a steeper hill to climb in the future. We're making it harder on ourselves down the line. And in this graph here, essentially it shows an early start to carbon neutrality could be reached with a 1.5% annual reduction in emissions. But if you wait and wait, eventually you reach a steep path where you have to be reducing something like 7.1% here at the in the purple graph. So we're digging ourselves a deeper and deeper hole when we delay. I also wanted to talk about the problem of continued investment in fossil energy and infrastructure when we are too slow in the transition to decarbonized energy. Here, we're looking at, on the left, a graph of crude oil prices since 2009. And crude oil is the main determinant of gas prices. So, and it's set in a global market, unlike, for example, like electricity, which is mostly locally sourced, especially when you're talking about renewables. And so it's not subject to those wild market swings that we see in oil prices. And so another benefit from sufficient action is avoiding that lock-in to these fossil fuels, which carry a price risk, which we're reminded of from time to time, including now. This is also coming out around natural gas. There's concerns around winter heating bills, which aren't such a concern here, but in other parts of the country, propane is a gas they use, in other places more than in California, but it's linked to the price of oil, so it's also spiking. So I wanted to cover that aspect of the economic risk. A third dimension of the cost of the risk of the damages that we risk if we delay action are these types of infrastructure, buildings, agricultural costs, or physical damages. Also, of course, ecosystem damages are important as well. What we're looking at in this graph is a graph of the number of structures that have been destroyed by wildfires over the years in California. And you can see the trend increasing with the last year, 2018, that horrible year when Paradise was destroyed. And I might have that wrong. I think 2018 was Paradise. In any case, there were nearly 23,000 structures destroyed by wildfires in 2018. And so, of course, that's another aspect of a failure to minimize warming is these types of damages. Most poignant, most important, of course, is the human loss, human suffering, cultural losses from communities, cultures maybe not able to survive the transition. We're certainly seeing that in some island nations. Here, I'm showing some California impacts related to extreme heat. California has an active, the state has an active research program. This comes out of their fourth climate change assessment that the state did, showing that heat waves in cities with inadequate climate action would lead to 2 to 3 times more heat-related deaths, and with lower income or less, more vulnerable populations being the ones most at risk. And the map at right demonstrates this with the greener areas being places less vulnerable to extreme heat, and the orange and red colored areas being most vulnerable to extreme heat. So you can see there's some justice issues related to extreme heat impacts to be on the lookout for. I wanted to flag, coming out of the economics profession, I wanted to acknowledge the failures in that area. Oh, we're just at 8:23. Okay, well, economists have really been underestimating this. We covered the 149 billion in wildfire damage. So, that was really what I wanted to cover. So thanks again, and I'm looking forward to the senator's comments and the discussion to follow. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Chris. You covered a lot of really important information there. We thank you for packing so much quality data into admittedly relatively short amount of time. I'm sure we could talk about this much more. I do encourage everybody to drop your questions for Chris and the Senator into the Q&A. We'll have an opportunity for a little bit of discussion afterwards. And actually, Chris, that's a really nice segue, because really a part of what we want to talk about here is, you know, people talk about, oh, if we want to create a new economy, it's going to cost us a lot. Let's not forget that not creating the new economy is already costing us a lot. That's the point we're making here. And to emphasize a little bit more about the impact of fossil fuels use and production on the health and well-being of vulnerable communities, I'd like to introduce Senator Elena Gonzalez. Senator, if you are with us there, here we go. Nice to see you. Senator Gonzalez represents the 33rd district and its nearly 1 million residents in the Long Beach and Southeast LA area. Senator, you're a member of many important committees, including energy, utilities and communications, environmental quality, and you're the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee. We're totally proud and happy that you could join us today, and I welcome you to make your remarks, after which we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A. Please.
Thank you so much, Doron, and thank you to Ellie and the whole Climate Center group and team. It was wonderful seeing you front and center at COP26, my very first COP, but also for the invitation today to speak to everybody. Yes, as the new chair of transportation, I'm just really, really delighted to be able to be in this capacity in a really pivotal moment for climate change, and also representing a community, a large community of 1 million residents who are dealing with impacts from port congestion, from exide, from soil and water contamination, and from many, many trucks going up and down the 710 communities, diesel trucks. So they're inhaling at this very moment diesel particulate matter. So I think I have an indelible responsibility, but a really strong responsibility that I want to ensure that sees its way through the legislation that we create, especially in 2022, and especially coming home after COP26. We've got a lot of work to do. So representing these communities, as many of you know, Long Beach is my home, but Southeast Los Angeles is also a place that I represent. And a lot of these communities often feel that they're not part of the climate change discussion. So that is really my role as well, is to ensure that they are embedded in these discussions, from energy, from transportation equity, to issues that we're now starting to see in the LA Times front and center, like extreme heat. So those are issues that, you know, I would love to talk about in more detail and certainly take questions on as well. But as chair of transportation, we'll start there. You know, being the first Latina in the state Senate, but the first woman in the last 20 years, the last senator to chair, a woman senator to chair transportation was Senator Betty Carnett, who we just lost this year. But having this lens of equity, this lens of being a Latina who represents these communities is very important for me. What I'm looking to do in the next legislative session is really look at ways that we can modernize our clean transportation programs. We've already invested quite a few dollars through our last state budget towards Clean Cars for All and a rebate for folks that are in lower income communities, but really ensuring that equity is at the main juncture as it pertains to transportation, because we do have to reduce emissions, but we want to ensure that we're working on reducing emissions with our low income communities first. In addition to being chair of transportation, of course, in the work that I'm doing, of course, I'm also legislating on a lot of transportation issues. So I authored this year, SB 671, which creates a clean freight corridor efficiency program to ensure that roadway infrastructure is ready to support clean freight vehicles. Having the port in my district is very important. The 710 is a trade corridor. Again, hundreds of thousands of diesel trucks going in and out of the 710 through our communities into the Inland Empire to warehouses that are also polluting is a focus that I want to maintain, that we clean up those, the roadways, ensure that there's safety for our truck drivers, additional safety mechanisms and regulations, but also that we're cleaning up both on the infrastructure side and the vehicle side. But on top of that, you know, we're looking ahead in the Senate. What's nice is our pro tem has delegated us, myself and about 8 other senators, to a climate change working group in which we will be working, all of us, through up and down the state to be able to look at climate change policy. Some of us who come from COP26 looking at policies that, we have homework when we got home to really figure out what that looks like, but also other senators that are really invested in the climate change space. And so we look forward to a really bold legislation. I look forward to hearing more ideas from the Climate Center and from many of the guests in the webinar on what we can do on many of these fronts. So I look forward to that, and thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your remarks and for all of your hard work in Sacramento. We do have some questions, and I urge all of you who have additional questions, please drop them in the Q&A. But I got a couple questions to start with you, Senator. I know you need to leave at 10:40, and Chris Bush has joined us again. We'll have a couple more minutes, but I want to start with a couple of questions for you, Senator. One is from our actually LA organizer, Geraldine Lopez Mendoza. Are there specific climate resiliency projects in your district that are in development? Are there specific things that you want to point us to, and how can we help support those?
Yeah, thank you so much. Right now, as it pertains to the sort of global work that we're doing, I think in my office, what I've been really focused on is really the port congestion issue. Just yesterday, our Governor Newsom came to the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles, and we really have to figure out, and we just had a hearing 2 weeks ago with Assemblymember O'Donnell to really get to the issue of port congestion. Of course, the logistical part and the operational part of ensuring that we don't have ships idling diesel particulate matter on top of the other diesel trucks that are coming in and out of our communities, but ensuring that communities are prepared as well. So they are going to start, I think cities like Linwood and Paramount are going to start these climate plans based on this issue of port congestion. And I think they're starting to realize that they need to do this at the local level as well. While we're tackling the state and federal issues, these local municipalities are really leaning into this issue started by port congestion. So I think that there's a lot of plans in the works, and I look forward to supporting them. And I hope that, this next year in our budget, I think we're projecting about $30 billion surplus. I'm hoping that this really speaks to the values of climate change and that we're really supporting these smaller cities to be able to create these climate resilience plans in many of these areas that need it the most.
Wonderful. We look forward to partnering with you on those kinds of programs. We've got a couple of questions coming in about the working group that you mentioned. Several people would like to learn more. Which other senators are part of that group? And what would be your dreams or visions for bold climate policies that you hope this group will be able to put forward? What might be some of the things that you hope to see in the next legislative session? So if you could talk more about the working group and what you hope to achieve with that working group within the context of legislation. That's something a lot of people are asking about.
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. So I believe there's 9 senators, and I hope I get them all right, but it's myself, Senator Allen, Senator Wajkowski, Senator Limon, Senator Durazo, Senator Hertzberg, Senator McGuire, I believe Senator, there's I think 3 more senators that I am forgetting, but I will make sure you have a list. Senator Laird, of course, he is the chair of this committee. And so there are a couple more, and we'll make sure, and they may change just based on everyone's interest this year. And I know Senator Becker, although he's not part of the committee, has been very vocal on the issue of green, obviously clean tech, and really been front and center on many of these issues. So I'm sure that it'll change. But I think what we're looking at right now, of course, is we're creating these pillars of sorts that are obviously starting with that we need bold solutions. We cannot, although COVID, we can use that as an excuse these last 2 years, but no longer. I mean, during COVID, we saw the deep inequities with climate policies our lack of climate policies and climate change issues. In my district alone, and of course, Los Angeles, as we have been seeing extreme heat, you can be in one zip code of lower income and lower income and have a 6 to 10 degree hotter experience than somebody who lives on the coast. And that's really in my district as well. I've got part of the coast in Long Beach where, you could be cooler than you are in inland, the Southeast Los Angeles area. So I would expect that we are going to be doing things, and I know the Assembly has been working very vigorously, Assembly Member Luis Rivas and Eddie Garcia and Insurance Commissioner Lara, on extreme heat, a risk assessment, and that's great, but we actually need to do sort of a value check in our budget as well. I mean, there's building codes that require heating. They don't require air conditioning. And now that we're in this new space, California needs to start thinking of extreme heat in a different way. So I think that might be one opportunity for us. I know there are senators that want to continue to work on the space of wildfires, like Senator McGuire has been front and center, Senator Laird has been front and center on that. For myself, it's transportation equity. Again, modernizing our plans and our rebates to ensure that those rebates actually get into the hands of low-income communities. It's also looking at our medium heavy duty space. Diesel particulate matter, again, still exists. We've got hundreds of thousands of medium heavy duty trucks we need to convert over to either battery electric or to hydrogen fuel cell. And so there are deep investments that we need to make. And we also have misclassification going on at our ports. So there is a lot of work to be done in this transportation space that I'm ready to lead on. And then I know other senators, again, extreme heat, wildfire, mitigation, and I'm sure there'll be more to talk about. So
Great.
Lots to do there.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I'd like to bring in Chris Bush and Ellie Cohen if she's available. You had mentioned earlier, Senator, it'd be great to get some ideas of some bold climate bills. So, we've got this opportunity. We've got this great panel. Chris, while we're here, based on your thinking and analysis on the cost of delay and what it's costing us to not do what we should be doing, what might be some things you might suggest that the climate working group should take a closer look at? And then Ellie, I'll give you an opportunity to comment also while we have the senator with us for 5 more minutes. Chris?
Thanks. And well, one thought that comes to mind, and I suspect, or I would guess the senator knows this already, excuse me, is air conditioners are actually use the same technologies that heat pumps use. You hear about heat pumps, and they're basically pretty close to air conditioners, but they're also one of the most exciting things going on in decarbonizing buildings. They're sort of, heat pumps are sort of what are like EVs are to the transportation space. They're not a whole solution, but they're an important technological solution. And essentially, heat pumps use the same technologies air conditioners use to make, instead of making cooler air, they make warmer air. So that's a nice place where I think, we have overlapping, and a lot of people don't have air conditioning. I don't have air conditioning. So it's an overlapping, I would say, mitigation or abatement option and resiliency step, because we're hearing horrible stories about people facing the risk of even now, having their windows open in wildfire season because it's so hot out. But there's smoke outside, so they're exposing themselves to dangerous air in that case. So I wanted to lift up that particular idea or topic.
Yep. Thank you, Chris. That's great. I think we can all see why you don't need an air conditioner, because you're living in a cloud forest. So it's probably nice and cool on the bridge where you are. Thank you for bringing up that issue. And I just want to bring in Ellie really quickly. Ellie, before we turn to the senator for final comments, what thoughts do you have for the working group?
I have lots, and I'd love to meet with the whole group, Senator, whenever I can. But and I'm sure you all have great ideas as well. And I think, as I mentioned in my presentation in the beginning, setting bold goals to start with is huge and has made an enormous difference. And we really haven't done that now since 2017 as a legislature, where it's truly codified into law in California. So we're definitely hoping that we can do something like 80 by 30, meaning 80% reduction in emissions from 1990 by 2030. The climate reality, the biology, the physics, the chemistry demands nothing less, actually. And so some big goals. And then the question is, how do we get there? And we need to look at every sector. And it's clear that, for example, with solar started with a lot of support from public funds, state, from the federal government. Same with addressing COVID and getting to actually having, a solution to that. And so having vaccines, it started with the government promising to buy large amounts of the vaccine. And so we need to invest big time upfront, and the economy and the companies that are working on these various solutions in every sector can then take off. And so I understand, rumor has it that we may have a $35 billion surplus again this coming year, and we ought to be using it to invest upfront in these climate solutions to jumpstart the investments in the marketplace so that we can solve it in an equitable way and make the biggest difference possible for everybody.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you, Chris. And I know you've only got a minute or two left, Senator, so I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond and wrap up your thoughts before we turn to more questions for Chris and Ellie. You can stick with us for the Q&A too. But Senator, what final thoughts do you have?
Yeah, I want to thank Chris and Ellie for those comments because they're both spot on. In terms of the air conditioning, again, I think that's, you know, an incredible resiliency setup that we can create, and the framework that we can create to lift up the issue of extreme heat. So I think it's very, very important. And similar to places like in Northern California, and now we're starting to see wildfires, unfortunately, in Los Angeles, LA also, these communities near our ports that I often think about because I represent also have these impacts. It's compounded, the extreme heat compounded with, you know, higher emissions, and it's just unfortunate. So these are the inequity, those are the costs as well as just the human cost of just people suffering from asthma, suffering from higher rates of cancer. I mean, I hate calling my district Asthma Alley. I see it in the LA Times and I continue to say that. There's cancer, they call it Cancer Alley, Asthma Alley. We have toxic tours, no more. And so to Ellie's point as well, I think, again, our values need to speak into our budget. And so $35 billion, I can assure you that if I do get another allotment for my district, it is going towards climate change policies. That is a guaranteed fact. All of my district is impacted to some extent by soil, water contamination, air quality. So we've got a lot of work to do. And this, and I'm just really grateful that the Pro Tem has put this working group together, and we have really strong senators that are committed to ensuring that, to Ellie's point, that it is bold legislation all around. The last thing I will say is that, you know, the Climate Center, I want to thank you all for being, again, front and center at COP26, but really guiding us and helping us. And we're going to need your continued support. Many of these pieces of legislation are not easy. As we know, El Marisucci, our assembly member, had an incredible bill, of course, as Ellie mentioned, to reduce emissions and to look at, technologies that would do so. But we are now in a space that we don't have that, it didn't pass. So now we're here and we've got to start all over and reset next year. What I will say is what I've learned from COP26 is to ensure that we're not only to communities of color, but we're also including the workforce. I learned a lot in Scotland about skills passports and how we embed the communities that are actually working on the front lines in many of these polluting industries, that we need to embed them a little bit more. And we've got some work to do in that space, and this group will do that. The last thing I will say is that corporate responsibility is so important. That corporate responsibility, we kind of saw that front and center at COP26, but we really need them to come to the table. It's not just government and our advocates doing this work. It really needs corporate support as well, and private industry saying that we want to reduce emissions as well. And we saw that a little bit in Scotland with, again, they've got lots of good work on the renewable space where private, public, and industry is there. So we've got to change the narrative and get that framework going here in California, and I look forward to that. So thank you very much for having me. Look forward to working with you all.
Thank you. Thank you. And yep, go ahead, Ellie.
No, that's great. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Senator, and thank your staff also on our behalf. They were all wonderful to work with. We want to thank you for your time. And I'm going to turn now to Chris. We do have time. Take care, Senator. Go do the work. Chris, we have time for like one more question before we turn to our next speaker, Ibrahim. So I wanted to give you a chance to answer this because it's a really interesting question. Could you comment on how much investment will it take in the next decade from the public sector to address the climate crisis in speed and scale? We're talking about investing for jobs, health, and equity. What kind of investments do you estimate are required for us to actually make a difference?
You know, we have a model that I'm in the middle of updating. It's the California Energy Policy Simulator. If you go to california.energysolutions.com, you can find the current version, which is a couple of years old now. It hasn't been updated for COVID. And I guess what I'm letting you know is I'm in the middle of sort of digging in on that question, but I don't have sort of a handy number to drop in terms of what's needed. I do know it's going to be a mix of, public and private. We're expecting, commercial fleets and people to buy EVs and buildings are mainly privately owned. So it's a mix of private and public, and but we need more of both, that's for sure. I wanted to offer one thought on the issue or the topic of target setting. I completely agree with Ellie that, our SB 32 target, 40% below 1990, set in 2017, is dated. It needs to be updated, strengthened. But one challenge is that we're not even on track for that target because, and a challenge is that the Air Resources Board is really tasked with deciding if we are or not, and there's no process requirements upon them to use any particular methods in determining whether more policies are needed. So I don't think a new target for the state without new implementing mechanisms around how the target is to be met is going to make a difference. Specifically, you could imagine some sort of maybe CBO type outfit, which analyzes the scoping plans put together by the board. The scoping plan is the state's strategies, economy-wide policy strategy setting process. It's the only one. It's done about every 5 years. And a problem right now is that the state doesn't even want to include a reference scenario. And if, in other words, they're saying they don't want to decide what direction we're heading currently, which is what the reference scenario would be, because and there's some understandable reasons for them. They don't necessarily know what a model is going to tell them to do. It's sort of there's some uncertainty there, and so it's I don't want to. I think most the people at CARB are good public servants, and I don't want to pretend the opposite. But I do think there's some issues around target setting that would need to be changed for that to make that type of policy really work.
Wonderful. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, targets without teeth are, give us the danger of falling into the trap that Greta Thunberg said was what COP amounted to. I believe she summed it up with 3 words. Was it, Ellie? Blah, blah, blah. So we don't want to just blah, blah, blah. We need to actually do things, and we need to invest in those things. And I'm happy to turn it over to our next speaker. And Chris, stick around. We've got a lot of great questions. We'll have some time at the end for further conversation. And I hope to bring you back into that conversation towards the end of the webinar. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'm going to ask my colleague Lorianne to drop the link to Climate Safe California one more time. I see a number of you have already endorsed Climate Safe California. We thank you for that. This is the policy program that would basically make California do exactly what we're talking about, which is take bold action and invest as needed. So if you've not yet done so, please take a moment to endorse Climate Safe California. And in order to talk actually specifically to the question that was just asked, I hear from his staff that he's going to be talking about some specific numbers. I'm very happy to introduce Ibrahim Al-Husseini. Ibrahim is a venture capitalist and a sustainability-focused entrepreneur and philanthropist dedicated to advancing social and environmental change globally, and particularly in emerging economies. He founded Full Cycle Climate Partners, which is focused on reversing the effects of climate change by accelerating the deployment of climate restoring technologies. We're very happy to have Ibrahim with us here today. He's going to speak on the opportunities for business in taking bold action to address the climate crisis. Ibrahim, if you're with us, I'd like to turn the floor over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Adoran and everyone. Maybe I can start before I begin the presentation of sharing a little bit of history on how I came into climate investing. Can you guys see and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, super. So I'm an immigrant. I moved to the US in the early 90s, and my family grew up in the Middle East, and we own a home on the Red Sea. So I would go back and visit and scuba dive in the same spot all through the 90s into the early 2000s. And one of the things I noticed is the degradation in the quality of marine life every time I'd scuba in the same spot. So what was kind of a very lush, vibrant ecosystem turned barren and full of plastic within a decade. And I realized by the late 90s, early 2000s, that the cost of human civilization on the planet was devastating. It's just a lot of it was happening underneath the surface of the water before it became obvious to the rest of us above the surface of the water. And I changed all my economic activity to investing in climate technology starting in 2002 onwards. And and I developed a thesis with my partners at Full Cycle Climate Partners that is extremely nuanced when it comes to the space. Because obviously when you have 2 decades of experience investing in the space, one of the things that happens is you learn through trial and error, and you also get to tweak the model over time such that you feel like you finally land on something that is going to move the needle, which is very different than something that feels like it's going to move the needle, which is a lot of times what I see happening in this space. Is there's a general haphazard approach to investing in climate. And somebody said an analogy earlier around the house burning down. And I use a similar analogy where I say, for example, that if the house is already on fire, you can't invest in firefighting technology. It's too late for that. So a small nuance that we focus on in Full Cycle Climate Partners is we only invest in technology that has been technically proven. And our job, like you said in the intro, is to accelerate the rollout of that critical technology that's been proven around the world as fast as possible, since we're in a race against time. So there's a lot of other nuanced aspects of our model, but the whole idea behind Full Cycle is to make sure that we switch our economy from this high carbon and toxic underpinning of 19th and 20th century technologies to their 21st clean, sustainable alternatives as fast as possible. Because of what I said, we are in a race against time, and now is better than new is one of our mottos. So with that said, let me see if I can work this, screen sharing situation. Can you see my screen okay?
Looks good, Ibrahim, looks good.
Okay, super. All right. So, so the nice thing about what I'm sharing with you is it allows for people across the ideological spectrum to participate in the transition to a low carbon future. And what I mean by that is we introduced the idea of risk-adjusted returns and profit to the whole solution of climate change. Because whether we like it or not, whether we think it's the right thing to do or not, human beings are going to move capital in the direction of things that grow their wealth. Asset managers, all kinds of institutional investors, they are going to move the bulk of that capital towards those types of opportunities. And we needed to make sure that we provided the highest carbon return on investment in the most risk-adjusted return profile, so we can move the biggest pieces of capital around the world to this transition, which is a very hopeful mechanism because, as you know, human self-interest, whether it's economic or self-preservation, is one of our biggest motivators, and history proves that time and time again. Now, so what are the numbers related to this transition that we talked about? First of all, it's important to clear up that low carbon infrastructure does not only mean solar and wind and energy. It means a lot of different things that are actually the majority of the solution that are beyond solar and wind. So we're going to talk a little bit about that because these other parts of the economy actually contribute an outsized return, outsized warming return, because of the molecules that they emit are a lot more heat trapping than CO2. So for example, when a landfill in a developed nation that's supposedly sealed, sanitary, is still emitting methane, that molecule of methane is 86 times more heat trapping than CO2 in the first 20 years of its being a fugitive gas from that landfill. So when you have a molecule that's 86 times more heat trapping, or another one like nitrous oxide that's 350 times, or a refrigerant that's 13,000 times more heat trapping than CO2, you end up finding areas that you can target in the economy that have an outsized climate return in the short term. Because as you can imagine, warming begets warming. So we need to front load our impact, because every time we invest a dollar with good intentions, if that dollar isn't prioritized to slow down warming as much as possible, that warming recedes glaciers, it melts ice, which means that less of the sun's radiation is reflecting back into space, which means the earth is absorbing more heat, which means there's an accelerating warming cycle that's happening. And we're not thinking strategically, we're not prioritizing, we're just doing shotgun approaches, which is too haphazard for something as existential as global warming and climate change. So these are the industries that encompass all of that. So somebody asked about the numbers. Right now, we're investing under $800 billion a year. It's 2.3 trillion a year that's needed in the energy infrastructure, and a total of almost 7 billion a year that's needed to reach the Paris Climate Accord numbers. And the sad thing is those numbers don't mean a healthy climate, by the way. They just mean a less than worst case scenario, which is very unusual for us as a species to, instead of talking about how to hand over a clean and healthy climate to the next generation, our goals now, our conversation, our narrative is all around how to hand the least hobbled climate to the next generation, which I think is a little bit short-sighted of us. You know, we are a species that have set foot on the moon of our planet. I think we can find ways to accelerate the growth of all of these underpinnings of modern civilization and end this ugly chapter in human history that's, you know, provided a lot of good, but now we can accelerate the end of it and begin our first time since our species existed, where we can coexist with the natural world in harmony. We just have to have bigger, better goals. So again, the 70% of the opportunity is in the new classes of sustainable infrastructure that we can talk about. And that's where Full Cycle at least focuses on, because like I said, there are molecules that are a lot more heat trapping than CO2 that need to be addressed in the short term. They make up 1% of atmospheric greenhouse gases, but are responsible for close to 42% of the warming. So if you have a finite amount of money, you're obviously going to focus on that 1% that's going to be that's going to slow things down dramatically. And then once that's handled, start focusing on the 99%, which is what CO2 makes up in volume and atmospheric greenhouse gases, but it is the weakest greenhouse gas. There also is the added benefit of focusing on these short-lived climate pollutants, the methanes and the nitrous oxides, is because CO2 is a gas that we have evolved to inhale and exhale without damage or too much damage to our system. Nitrous oxide scars our respiratory system. 1 of 4 children in New Delhi, for example, have compromised respiratory systems because of the level of nitrous oxide in the air that they breathe on a daily basis. Methane is known to hurt crop yields. So there's this tertiary added benefit of focusing on these short-lived pollutants, and those are the industries that we focus on because of all the obvious reasons I just mentioned. Also, if you believe that carbon markets one day are going to be functional and scalable, which we very much believe, so we don't underwrite for it as an investment firm, but we believe these carbon markets will be very lucrative. And when you focus on gases that are a lot more heat trapping, you get many, many multiples on the monetization than if you focus on CO2 emissions. So, and the reason why I keep going back to finances is because, again, the biggest pools of capital are in the hands of institutional investors, and the easier we make it for them, the more obvious we make it for them to deploy into funds like Full Cycle, the faster we're going to get out of this fossil fuel intensive part of our story as a species. And I want to introduce you to this really interesting metric that we came up with at Full Cycle to make our job much more stringent. It's called CROI 20. CROI stands for carbon return on investment. So per dollar invested, how much CO2 or CO2 alternative, the alternative part is addressing these other gases that I've been talking about. How much is that dollar actually doing? So if you look over here, and this is an outline of some of the technologies that we've invested, you're talking about 8 times more CROI 20, 10 times more CROI 20 than something like solar and wind. Solar and wind are critical. They have to be invested in. We have to roll out a clean, renewable energy future. But again, I am focused and keep talking about prioritization. And let's just talk about prioritization. Where should dollars be invested in the short term? And these are other areas that we're looking at as a fund. Obviously, there are some areas that do require venture investment. 80% of the solutions have already been invented and need rollout, but there are areas that do need venture capital so we can get them to commercializations. So if you're a venture investor and have opportunities that, to accelerate getting to, clean cement and ways to smelt iron and aluminum in a carbon negative way or carbon neutral way, once those technologies have evolved, funds like Full Cycle get to roll them out because we spend 85% of our capital on projects. We have a very specific model that's very entrepreneur friendly and also very thoughtful for climate, because it becomes an engine for accelerating their technology by putting 15% of our capital into the corporate equity of these technology companies and 85% into their projects. So we allow them to bridge the commercialization gap, which is one of the biggest problems that these companies get into. Once they've proven their technologies, they now have to find an alternative way of funding their first commercial plants before infrastructure funds can take them on to the next stage in their rollout globally. So with that said, that is what Full Cycle does, and it came out of truly 20 some years of investing through, I've started a venture fund that's done well but has not been as effective as Full Cycle Climate can be in its CROI 20. I've invested directly out of my family office. This is the most effective model that we've been able to develop to address this the existential crisis with private capital, and all the help from the senator, from the federal government, from governments around the world to make our investments, not specific, all the space, all the climate funds out there and the technologies that represent them and the companies that represent them, make our job easier, more streamlined, less bureaucratic. The faster we'll get there, the more asset managers of all kinds focus more on the power that they do have, not on just checking existing boxes, but actually thinking a little bit outside of those traditional allocation boxes that they used to have used for decades, maybe centuries, to preserve and grow capital, and factor in the fact that if we don't address climate change, all asset classes, all investments will be effective. Even if you just look at it as a hedge to protect the rest of your portfolio, we have to start thinking outside of the box and put more money into this space. It's critical and we're overdue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim.
How do I get out of this share?
At the bottom, drop your arrow to the bottom of your screen and you should have a little red stop. There you go. And now you're back live and in person. Nice to see you again. I want to thank you for a really thoughtful presentation. I think I would be surprised if everybody on this call doesn't have perhaps a new way of thinking about the kind of investments we need to make. And thank you for helping open our eyes to sort of a broader range of opportunities within the private sector that can really accelerate climate solutions in a way that some of the incrementalism that we've been seeing will not achieve. So I want to thank you for that. And we've got some time for some questions. I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to bring Chris Bush back into the conversation. But I want to start with a sort of a meta question, because this is an interesting one I've been thinking about ever since I did my master's thesis at UC Berkeley on composting. Got me thinking about circular economy and all that kind of sort of way of thinking. So the question comes from Bob and Gail, who talk a lot about the private investments that they've made in their own life to be more sustainable. And they suggest that we need to think about something other than growth, that growth and linear growth are maybe part of the issue. So as someone who thinks a lot about these kind of issues and is actually directing funds into, revolutionary potentially technologies, growth, should that still be our mantra? Do you have any comments or thoughts on that sort of larger question?
So this is a meta question that I don't give myself the luxury of entertaining because I don't have time. It's the same thing that when I hear growing up, coming from a developed nation, growing up to son of refugees, moving to the US, having a kind of unique trajectory. When I hear a lot of people on the US coasts say things like, if everybody could do this, if everybody could do that, in my mind, I remember that everybody does not mean, we don't represent everybody, right? We don't represent the world. Like if, I'm sitting in a hotel in New York or in my house in Venice, California, I don't represent the world. Even if I lived an extremely conscious life, I only ate vegan food 100% of the time. I didn't drive a car. I only took a bicycle. I recycled everything. I composted everything. My carbon footprint over a lifetime will drop from 2,590 tons to something like 1,300 tons over my lifetime. And that's 1,300 tons of CO2 emissions or equivalent, more than the planet can handle anyway. So there's all of these super complex ways of looking at this. My approach is, how do we make human civilization carbon neutral by default, such that we're having no ideological debates. We're not screaming at the people who are driving the Hummer and trying to shame them and creating this ideological divide and fights all over the world. And we don't represent Malaysia, and we don't represent India, and we don't represent Indonesia, and we don't represent China, or the entire Middle East, or the whole continent of Africa, who are now just joining the consumer ranks for the first time and trying to tell them that they should live this way or that way. We've lived through an entire consumer generation and took our kids to Disneyland and bought toys and traveled and saw the world and ate all the steaks and did all the things. And we don't want them to do any of that. And we may be right. And we may say, hey, listen, mea culpa, we did all these things. Please don't do them. It's not like they're going to listen. But what if our existence as a species is carbon neutral by default, because the underpinnings of human civilization are designed that way anyway. So when you throw a piece of paper in the garbage, there's a whole thing that happens behind the screen that turns it back into the molecules of new things in a perpetual cycle, and we don't have any waste. What if our energy system never produces emissions, and when we turn on the light, they light up, and hot water comes out of our shower, and it doesn't have to be at the cost of future generations? Like, those solutions are the ones that I'm focused on, specifically because I don't feel like I have the time to change everyone's culture around the world in time to make a difference.
Great, that's a great answer. I hear you, and thank you for your thoughtful response. I'd like to move from the meta to the micro. This is another question that came up. So the Climate Center is focused very much on policy. You're focused on investment in the private sector. But we believe that the right policies could unlock greater amounts of innovation and investment in the private sector. So I'd like you to perhaps take a moment to comment. What policies or regulations could be implemented or eliminated or changed that would make it easier for you and the companies you work with to accelerate the pace of innovation?
Well, for one thing, project approval. I mean, if you want to break ground, let's say on a molecular circularity plant that takes mixed waste of any kind and turn it into new building blocks of new material in perpetuity, like the environmental permitting, the land permitting, the construction permitting, the bureaucracy maze that you have to go through takes you years just to break ground. Like, why are funds like mine have to factor in where in the world it is fastest to break ground on projects based on who has the most streamlined policies and least bureaucracy? And California is the worst. So these types of things are super that need to happen and need to happen faster, because like I said, we're 40 years late to addressing the problem in the first place. And I understand there's a lot of bad actors out there that take advantage of things and find loopholes, and we're trying to stop them, from doing the wrong thing. And we have to have policies, but they have to be smarter policies, and they have to be timely policies. And we have to weigh the risk of moving slow versus moving fast when you're dealing with something so large like a destabilization of a planet's climate. So permitting approval would be fantastic.
Right. Okay. Excellent. That's wonderful. And I noticed Allison, who's a local government representative, asked what local governments can do to help the companies that you work with. And it sounds like streamlining the permit process would be high on your list of wants and needs. So I'd like to invite Chris to join us back in the conversation. I've got a couple other things. Before I do that, just quickly, someone asked about sharing your slides. They're marked as private. Are those available for folks to share? What's your comment on that before I bring Chris back into the conversation?
Okay. Katie's my boss. She decides. I don't know.
Okay, we'll let Katie respond to that via the chat. Katie, if you just let folks know about that. So Chris, if you're back with us, there's this technical question. I want to come loop back to your conversation on heat pumps, because a couple of people have asked, mini split heat pumps use refrigerants. Why are they considered important climate solution technology? Again, we've gone from the meta to the micro, but I don't want to leave that question hanging. So Chris, if you're with us, can you talk a little bit about heat pumps and refrigerants and air conditioning, and is that really the best solution? What are your thoughts on that, if you're with us?
Well, if someone has a better solution, I'd love to hear it. I guess I'm back with Ibrahim on in terms of being a bit of a realist here, and we definitely need better of those types of chemicals. And I'm not up on exactly. I guess they use the same HFCs. That needs to get dealt with. I mean, there's the Kigali agreement that even the Trump joined, and so there are actions underway. California has mandates on a good number of those, and incentives on others through an F-gas program. I think they're called F-gases, and so yeah, that needs to be dealt with. But I mean, the only other option would be to expect people not to have heating and cooling. I don't know a lower impact technology to provide heating and cooling. And so, I had one thought in terms of what Ibrahim's great comments are, just building on what he said about what his comment made me think of is I'm sort of looking for the minimally disruption that we can have, because behavior change can be hard. People are creatures of habit. And so even though I think personally we'd be better off with a less materialistic kind of perspective as a species, it's not like the focus of my change, even though I'm happy to, agree that it would be better.
And I agree with that completely, Chris. It's not like I don't. I wholeheartedly agree. I just can't take that risk from a professional standpoint. That's all I was saying is I will work in parallel as people like yourselves and everybody else helps evolve our species from this, like bottomless pit of consumerism to a more evolved, content, kind society. Then, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing just in case just in case that doesn't get implemented in time. So it's not like I'm saying we are hopeless. I actually believe so much in humanity. There's just 8 billion of us, and that's a lot of people to change.
Yeah, that is a lot. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say we're going to have to. We're agreeing too much. We need some sort of argument to spice things up. But no, I agree. I'm also going to say I'm glad, even though it's not a focus of my advocacy or social change work, if you will. I'm glad other people are doing that work.
Wonderful. Well, what about population? You mentioned population that came up in the question, and I mean that's not how critical is that? I mean, we've got more people on the planet all the time. So how does that factor into our need for accelerated climate action? Chris, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I remember somewhat presumptuously lecturing a person about that in the Amazon once with 10 kids. I didn't know she had 10 kids at the time. So anyway, I just, it's not, I agree at a high level. I mean, it's definitely, the number of people times, it's a huge factor, even as we work, but I'm not sure, but population control, I don't think it should be a priority for the climate policy movement either, per se. Right,
and that perhaps ties, Ibrahim, to your earlier comments in regard to global equity. So I actually have another question for you, Ibrahim, from Lorenzo. He says that it's suggesting that a move to zero carbon by default society. In order to do that, we need to prioritize environmental and social justice as a first priority, including ethical care of all life, in addition to humans, and returning the care of critical ecosystems to indigenous people who've lived sustainably in those areas for thousands of years. How do these considerations of justice and care and equity figure into your investment strategies? That's a question from one of our attendees. Ibrahim?
So I agree with the question or the premise of the question. I don't know if returning land to indigenous people solves our problem from math standpoint. As let's return as much of it to indigenous people as possible. Let's reforestation and all that's all critical. I just don't think it reconciles the math in the time we need it to. What we do as a fund is we have equity mandates for investing in companies that we try not to force anybody to do, but to inspire them to do from a diversity standpoint, from a culture standpoint that we feel reflect our values and the values of let's say the evolving human narratives around how we'd like to see our future unfold. So we bring that as a very strong suggestion to all the companies that we invest in and hope to infuse them with what we believe are kind, thoughtful, sustainable, equitable ethos. And so far it's working. And to be honest and fair to them, is none of them needed our help. They were all grounded in that type of culture because that's why they dedicated their career to forwarding these types of technology and not building some other app that's going to slap a mustache on us on our video conference calls or deliver, pop brownie by drone to our doorstep or make our toaster talk to our fridge or whatever it is that we can deprioritize right now. They've built systems to make our food cheaper and faster and local and zero carbon and 99% water recycling. They've made, they're making fabric that it can be recycled up to 7 times if it's cotton and infinitely if it's synthetic. They're producing mass systems that take all our unsorted garbage and break it down into building blocks of new material in perpetuity. And this takes decades of time to do, and so much frustration as anybody who's an entrepreneur of these high capex complex engineering technologies knows. These people are genuinely, they care. That's they care and they embody these values naturally. That's why they dedicated such a big part of their career to it. So kudos to them.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm glad to hear that those are factors. Of course, your point, sort of your core point is we got to focus on the stuff that's going to get us there at speed and scale. And I very much appreciate that perspective. We feel the same way here at the Climate Center. I'd like to move on. We've got some action item for all of you to engage in. Before I do that, I'd just like to offer Chris and Ibrahim 1 minute each to kind of wrap up your thoughts. Any final comments? Chris, do you have any last comments you'd like to share with our audience before we move to our critical take action item and wrap things up as advertised by 11:30?
I guess, well, thank you for that. And thanks. The chat is really active and I'm learning some things. So that's thanks to everyone, really. Just wanting to, again, because too much bad news can be paralyzing and it's not really a good change strategy, especially when there's a lot of good developments coming along. I just wanted to mention how EV manufacturing has taken California auto manufacturing jobs to double the level that they were historically in the last 10 years. And even though we know Tesla has labor problems and I don't agree with Elon Musk on social policy, I don't think that means I don't want to have to shy away from that story about direct auto manufacturing jobs going up to nearly 20,000. And there's only 10,000 at Tesla. So that, a lot of those, about half of those are at other places. And the whole EV industry in California employs about 300,000 people per the LA Economic Development Commission, a report they commissioned, with average jobs paying about 90,000. So I guess just ending on that positive note.
That is a good positive note. And I would emphasize that the policies implemented here in California over the last 10 or 20 years have helped drive that industry. And that's more of what we need to see. And I love the focus on the private sector. Ibrahim, any final comments on the power of investing in climate solutions before I turn it over to Barry for our Take Action segment?
So here's a hopeful trend that I started my day with today. I was invited to go speak to the investment team of a $32 billion asset manager here in New York to help them navigate the demand that they're getting from their clients in investing in impact. And this is happening across the financial sector. The question is, and the reason why they asked me to come, and I'm sure members of my team and other people in the climate space are being invited as well, to educate them, because they genuinely want to provide real products and real solutions and not look like fools in front of these next gen wealth owners, because this generation grew up in the information age. They're not going to fall for some sort of greenwashing campaign that is just window dressing for their needs. They will fire that asset manager. They genuinely need real products, real knowledge, and the demand is really there. And that is a heartening reality that is happening across the world, because this is a trend. And thanks to every single one of you who is either speaking on this, working on this, listening and wanting to get educated, moving your money, pushing other people to move their money. All of this is a community that is growing by the minute all around the world. We are locking arms together in all the ways that we can move this forward. And that should give everyone hope, because as they say, the things take longer than we expect them to take, but once they take hold, they happen faster we ever imagined they could. And that's probably going to be part of the J curve of the movement that we're all part of. And I'm going to enjoy it as much with you. And I'll remember in this moment how we put another brick in that wall that we're building together. So thank you all for being part of this.
Wonderful, Ibrahim. Thank you so much for your words of hope that are not just hollow, but actually are backed up by $32 billion today, and who knows how much more tomorrow. So that's very exciting. I'm glad to hear that, and it echoes a lot of what we're hearing in the world. I want to thank the speakers. We've got just a few more minutes. I want to turn it over to my colleague Barry Vesser, because all of you participants, and I want to thank you all for being here, now have an opportunity to actually take some meaningful action in this regard. I'm going to turn it over to Barry to tell you what it is we're offering you the opportunity to do before I close it out in about 6 or 7 minutes. So Barry, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Duran, and thank you, Ibrahim and Chris. Great presentations and great Q&A session. And, you know, as Ibrahim was indicating, a lot of people are voting with their dollars in terms of investment. Another way to bring about the kind of systemic change we need is to start applying pressure and using your voice with your local elected officials. So you heard Ellie earlier describe Climate Safe California, and I hope you've all had a chance to endorse it. You'll be joining 1,450 people who have already endorsed it. And just a quick reminder, Climate Safe California offers climate solutions, a suite of climate solutions at the speed and scale that the science demands. It's a set of policies that would allow California to remove more climate pollution from the atmosphere than we emit by 2030, while creating thousands of jobs and building a more equitable, clean energy economy. So accomplishing a few of the things that our speakers have touched on today. To help do that, we're going to ask you to take an action, which you will find in the chat, that will reach out to your local elected officials, your county board of supervisor, or your mayor, and ask them to endorse Climate Safe California. This is so important because this is a big lift at the California state level, and those state legislators need to know that their counterparts in local government support bold climate action. So by doing that, and I encourage you to click on that link now and go to the page, you'll see there a description of why this is important first on the left-hand side of the screen. And then over on the right side, you will see the actual text of the email that will go to your elected official, who should be highlighted in the bottom of your screen there. So I'm just going to give you a minute to do that and encourage you to do that. And if you haven't had a chance to endorse Climate Safe California too, we hope that you will do that before we part company today. And I will turn it back to my colleague, Duran.
All right, well, thank you, Barry. And we hope all of you can take that action. And you may find yourself saying, we're not targeting representatives in your area. Do not fear. There's some other ways that you can participate in helping spread the word about Climate Safe California and accelerating the kinds of changes that our speakers today highlighted, all of whom were great. So I want to take a moment to thank Chris Bush, Energy Innovations, Ibrahim Al-Husseini of Full Cycle Climate Partners. I want to thank the Senator Elena Gonzalez, who was with us but had to leave, for her comments and her hard work. I want to thank all of you participants who've been here with us all day for this wonderful conversation that you've all helped stimulate, and for everything you do every day to help us get to a Climate Safe California more quickly. I want to thank all of our sponsors, River City Bank, Summit Bank, Blue Planet Energy, Willow Creek Wealth Advisors, MCE Clean Energy, and Full Cycle also for being a part of the presentation today. I'd like to urge you all to visit the Climate Center's website and sign up for our next webinar, Maximizing Benefits from Climate Investments. We're going to leverage what we talked about today with even more good news. So that should be a very exciting webinar. It's coming up on December 16th. My colleague Lorianne will drop the registration link into the chat one more time. The last thing I'll mention to everybody is that the full recording of this webinar will be made available to everyone who attended or registered and was not able to attend. You'll be able to share that with people whom you would like to hear the good news that we got from Chris and Ibrahim and Senator Gonzalez here today. So with that, I know we're at 11:27. I'm going to give you all a gift beyond price, which is 3 minutes of your life back. So on that note, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for being a part of this movement. And thank you for attending our webinar today. Please email us if you have any questions. I can be found at duran@theclimatecenter.org. And Elizabeth, we will answer that question for you as soon as possible. So thank you all once again for being here. We hope to see you at our next webinar on December 16th from 10 to 11:30. Same time, slightly different topic. And until then, thank you all very much, and especially to our speakers, our sponsors, and all of our promotional partners who helped make this webinar so successful today. So thank you all, and we hope to see you all again soon. And if I could just ask my colleagues to stay on for just a moment, that would be great. Thank you, Ibrahim. Take care. Good luck.